Hey, welcome back to Animation Dissection, the podcast that'll reset the timeline until it gets it right. Just for you! I am Neeksy, here with Zorak, of course.
I'm gonna be subtitled this episode, but you're gonna have a hard time keeping up with them because they're going too fast.
Yes, I'm going to be speeding down your dialogue by about 25% so I can even understand you half the time.
Get
Uh,
on my level.
you speak like such a literary novel. I just, I have to enjoy it. So, anyway, we are going to be talking about the Tatami Galaxy today, but first let's do some really quick animation, or at least animation-based news. So the first thing on the docket is that the Kickstarter campaign that we mentioned last time from the makers of Schoolgirls, they are making a new game called Indivisible, which has some really beautiful looking animation and design work going in it so far, is unfortunately not doing so well in terms of Kickstarter funding.
Well, Indiegogo funding.
Oh, sorry, Indiegogo. I should not be using Kickstarter as the kind of Kleenex clean when people say Kleenex or Xerox when they mean like a tissue or photocopier.
Devalue that term. It's their own damn fault.
Right. So they have an Indiegogo campaign. Well, I think Indiegogo works a little bit differently in that they will get the money anyway. Right?
Unfortunately, no, that's actually not the case because Indiegogo allows you to actually do different types of things, but the actual Indiegogo campaign for Indivisible is an all or nothing.
Aha.
So
And they're about, at least as at time of recording, I think they're something about 25% away from their goal, but at the same time, the rate in which they have been getting donations has been fairly slow, and or at least slower than what people were expecting.
I think they're actually at a third right now. They're
Oh.
like 40. They're at that. Like I think like around 500,000 out of 1.5 mil.
Hmm.
So, it's possible they could get there, but who knows?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about why it's not doing so well. I mean, like, as far as I remember, the Skullgirls game was pretty popular, at least lauded fairly well. I mean, yes, controversy aside, and I think there was a little bit of skepticism about the producer of the game before. I mean, during the Skullgirls development cycle. But other than that, after release, I remember it getting pretty good publicity and at least popularity on some level.
Their campaigns have had some issues though here and there when they were doing their own, the other previous funding like this. Part of the issue with this
Aha.
is also there's a lot of skepticism of how much games actually cost to make. So the thing they're talking about one of the things I saw that I don't know if it was the director for this or whatever was talking about the funding for this and some of the reason why they're struggling with this, and they were talking like, well, part of it is just that people don't have a very realistic view of how much games cost to make, in the sense that they think like, oh, they're asking too much, but it's like, no, games are very expensive. When say Bloodstain, that Castlevania, studio remake or whatever, was asking for 500,000, that's not enough money to make a video game.
No,
That
and even then, he had secured funding
sure.
beforehand. So, like,
And they're saying
and
for this
people don't
that they
realize that. Yeah.
and for this they're saying that they have already secured funding, but it is also reliant on them actually getting the 1.5 million because the publishing deal is completely separate from additional developmental costs.
So
A
it's
game like
kind
this,
of like a what they would say is matching funds, essentially.
certainly. And this is, a way of both getting, making sure like, okay, we'll give you this amount of money, but we need you to actually be able to make a game. We can't actually give you enough money for you to make a full game, so you're going to have to make out the 1.5 million on your own.
Yeah.
Which, that's what they're trying to do right here.
And
And
it's and in their mind, they instead of finding even more investors, which is let's say what a AAA studio, for example, would instead of necessarily going to a Kickstarter campaign because they usually don't have to, they would either a go to a bank to get a loan, although honestly they if it's a AAA studio they should already have the funds. And that aside, they would find additional investors. But the
well, a
problem
lot of
with
that would be
doing the
tied.
additional investors is that you often end up having to cede a certain amount of control over your content because you need to assure this investor that what they're investing in is a safe investment. And often you have to, change your content in order to make them feel secure.
Often that's tied to publishing deals where publishers do often will actually often fund projects, but then publishers actually end up getting very involved on the developmental side, and they as you said, they both dictate it and they also demand a lot more of the profit as well. The question I would ask for out of this more sense like, did they not make particularly very much funding off of Skullgirls where they can't reinvest it back into their next project? This indicates to me that they apparently didn't, or or they paying the wages for everyone and wanting everybody to have a good wage. It's they didn't make enough to give everybody a good livable wage out of the project going forward, which is unsurprising to some degree. Gaming doesn't actually pay off that super well for developers and whatnot. So
Yeah,
I
very
hope they get
rarely.
there. I mean, I hope they get there. Like I said, they're like 30% there, so I mean, they could get there still, if they get a second win, but we'll see.
Well, and again, like looking at the amount of work for this type of game, I mean, like it has a lot of unique animations. It has, I mean, and the amount of people and the quality of people that they're going to have to hire to execute this, is going to require a lot of money. And I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, in that the public in general, I don't think has a very good idea of how much it really costs to produce a lot of these things.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure what to necessarily attribute that to. I mean, I think maybe there's not to get all like damn millennials or anything like that, but the kind of dispensability of a lot of our entertainment these days, especially with like YouTube and Let's Plays and a lot of what we see on TV and on all this other stuff, we get a lot of free content that's kind of fairly quick, and we kind of consume it and then move on to the next thing. There's just so much out there that we kind of get this odd expectation about like you know uh, watching it is just as easy as making it, I'm sure. Like there's this kind of odd, strange logical disconnect that happens when we're kind of inundated with this kind of hyper consumption of media.
I mean, I think that's part of it. I think another aspect of it is that there is a degree of general entitlement. We have a very, in terms of the media and the internet, people think like, well, things that are available. It's, part of the reason why people say like, oh, I don't like the people making this game. Not necessarily using it as a just an example. Like, don't like the people making this game. Oh, instead of buying it, I'll just pirate it because that makes things right. And it's like, what? Like
Yeah, I mean,
that's
as a
if
one
you
of
have
the
the means
aspects
to
of
purchase it and you want to play it anyways, that is a really messed up way to think about, something that was created, and I mean that obviously that ties to some degree with like, manga and anime in the sense of like people going like, well, I can't, download it, with English subtitles or purchase the English stuff, so I will download it. It's kind of like, well, what else are they supposed to do? But at the same time, you don't necessarily you're obligated. It's a complicated issue. And another aspect of it, I think, is the fact that, like I said, a lot of existing Kickstarter projects for gaming were really underselling how much money it would actually cost to make the game. Look
yeah,
at the Shenmue
they
kick.
were definitely obscuring the amount of funding they had already acquired, or also how far along they were already in the process, what the nature of the state of the studio kind of was before that point. Like as you were saying,
Yep.
did is it did the Skullgirls game make enough money for them to be able to reinvest, or did it not? Those types of questions are often left unanswered, or they can't really present that type of info without kind of compromising themselves. So it leaves the public with just the idea that, oh, this type of game only costs like $50,000. Like to a lot of people every day, they think, well, that's a lot. It's like, well, $50,000. How many people does that hire on a decent salary? That would,
None.
yeah, well, maybe one person could do that.
Maybe.
I mean, again, indie gaming, like someone can definitely easily survive on 50,000 a year, but
I
again,
don't think that's even necessarily fair. Like, sure, for certain locales that might be the case, but keep in mind that like a lot of studios, even indie studios, are located in California, and
well,
I
again,
think
I'm
you're
not
very
saying
well
that's
aware that the cost of living in
oh,
like Silicon Valley is
oh, exactly.
massive.
Well, again, I'm not saying that's good or even sufficient, but I'm saying to the everyday person's logic in their
Yep.
life, when what they associate themselves, around the country with $50,000 for a year or a project or a contract or a salary, to them that's a lot, but they also don't extrapolate that further to, well, now you have an entire team, you have a whole bunch of other development things that they have to invest money into and time and all this other stuff. It's something that I think the average player, gamer, consumer, whatever label you want to use, it's not something they've really had to think about before. on
Sure.
the same level. And
I
so,
mean, I
it's
mean,
weird.
a good example also is the fact that like look at the Shenmue Kickstarter. That asked, I think, for something like 500,000, but then like just like a few months ago, the creator for that was like, actually, really to make the game, we probably would have actually needed around like 8 million, but we only got about four. And it's kind of like, wait, you guys weren't, you said you guys only needed like 500,000 to make this, or like a million or whatever it was to make this game. You were underselling it because you thought that was what you would be able to get money for at the very minimum, but not actually how much it would actually cost to make the game. So people are actually setting the goals low to say, okay, at least I'll get some money, as opposed to here's how much money I would actually need to do what I'm setting out and saying I'm going to do. And people are just betting on their being stretch funding to some degree.
Yeah,
Whereas
it's almost like a weird form of speculation, and it's this
yeah,
kind of odd underbidding process. And I think that's the same
absolutely,
process that is kind of screwing up a lot of the industries. You get a lot of these studios that will underbid each other to produce like either a movie or a TV series, and then when they actually get the project, they're like, "Yeah, we won the project over the other guys." And then they look at what they actually have in order to be able to make the movie. They go, "Oh fuck, we don't have the actual
yep,
money because we spent all our time underbidding." And instead of having to underbid, a producer for the production thing, they're underbidding the public.
yep,
So
absolutely,
it's kind of translating that, and it's strange. I mean, like Kickstarters and Indiegogos, the crowdfunding thing has, I think, we're in the early growing stages of it, and the way in which people as a public collectively think about it, and our behavior and things like that hasn't really been documented, or we haven't really formed, I guess I would say, norms around it. Like our
sure.
expectations around it aren't really set yet. And we've had some like really good examples, and then we've also had some disastrous examples. So we have, like Undertale, which has been, an incredible success story of doing this type of indie crowdfunding. And then we also had Mighty Number Nine.
Just don't know that
And
yet.
I would even say that I remember there was controversy over a Skullgirls crowdfunding thing where they made a whole bunch of promises that were pretty much impossible for them to make. It was things like promising certain products that no one had actually done any research on saying they could actually have them. Um, so I think a lot of people are just uneasy about these types of things right now.
Sure.
Like a lot of these things, like, that were funded 2 or 3 years ago, some of them are still waiting on the stuff with very little news or much to show for it. So like we're kind of going through a wave of results right now, if that makes
Yep.
any sense.
Yep. Yeah. I agree.
So next, in better news, we got a JoJo announcement.
Yeah, so JoJo Part 4, also known as Diamond is Unbreakable, or as it was initially called, Diamond is Not Crash, was actually announced to be getting a anime adaptation from David Production, the company that made the previous, most recent JoJo adaptations. Part 4 is interesting is that it's the JoJo part that's never gotten any sort of adaptation, just like Part 2 previously and everything past Part 4. And Part 4 is probably my favorite
It's
of them,
probably one
actually.
of the more famous ones and kind of starts to define a lot of the rest of the series, doesn't it?
I mean, part three kind of did a lot of that, but part four it's got a lot of very different feel. It starts where JoJo starts getting visually weirder and a lot more visually experimental. Whereas like the first one is like all the previous parts, they have their own sort of unique style, and the style did change over time. But
But there is
part
I remember within part four, there is the very sudden style
I
shift.
mean, they shift the style very much like on a chapter to chapter basis, or sometimes within the same chapter, depending. It's one where they play a lot more with the dynamism of character design to kind of like give like a feel where like one of the major characters they introduce very early on and have him look very intimidating, but then within like 4 pages, he looks like a much nicer guy than he looked previously.
Yeah.
So
Well,
they,
that was
they
also, I think, a thematic or at least a character based thing.
absolutely, but I mean,
Yeah.
just saying like it's him playing around more with using the art styles to go into interesting places rather than going extremely towards consistency. But part four is my favorite. It's probably got one of my favorite plots and a lot of my favorite characters, and just a lot of just fun asides. I look forward to seeing how well they manage to execute it. So we
Yep.
have no date for that yet, no calendar even, no real explanation. What they're just saying like, hey, we got greenlit to do it. So Could be spring, could be another year. We'll see.
At the same time, I'm also not entirely surprised they announce it, just because JoJo itself is such like a popular series, and I feel like the previous seasons have been successful. I think artistically, at least enough that I think there is a demand for them. Like, keep going, keep making more episodes, for the love of God.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they manage to keep going like this past part 4 even. Part 5 is exceedingly popular, and part 6 is. I mean, there's certainly fans of part 6. I'm not gonna say dislike it personally. I'm not a huge fan of it, but going past that point, part 7 is a huge change, and it was also like 4 times the length of like any other previous part. So.
Well, that was when he changed magazines, right?
Yes. Well, he changed
Right.
magazines halfway through, and he also went monthly halfway through that.
Right. So
So
there was that big.
it's got a very hard difference from the prior work. So it'll be interesting to see if they go that far. I could easily see him saying, "Nah, you're not doing that right now," because that's then pretty close to actually catching up at that point. I don't think they're going to let They're not going to let David Production do the ongoing work at all, because that does not seem what they're actually aiming for here. They're going for legitimacy, and rather than just like, oh, we got a thing, we need to make an anime about it so we can make enough money, because that.
Well, in general, it seems like they are kind of pulling away from doing the kind of filler season style
Absolutely.
thing. I mean, other than a couple, I would say, legacy things like One Piece, for example, they have decided really like, you know what, we're just going to split stuff up into seasons. Like, just doing the filler shit is just not necessary. I mean, I think before the reason they did that is so that way they wouldn't have to relinquish their time slot. But now it seems like, I think with all the alternate distribution models, the time slot is not as important as it used to be. So that kind of
I
freed
mean,
them up from having to go like, well, if we split this season up, then we're going to have to relinquish the time slot and hope we get it back again.
I don't think that's actually the case, strictly
Hmm.
speaking, for certain works. I think that's the case where it's like a weekly shonen work, but then there's other works where, look at the first Full Metal Alchemist, where the issue is that the work wasn't completed when they started animating it. There wasn't actually a good point for them to do a hard break, so instead, the first Full Metal Alchemist anime has its own original
Oh,
plot
ending.
lines
Yeah.
after a certain point. And there's been a lot of that sort of stuff into the history, and if they were to go and try to animate, for JoJo, like the most recent part that's still ongoing, if they were to start animating it right now, there's no way that they could pad it out with filler even. They would have to, go ahead and make their own thing, which I don't think is what they're going to allow. So,
No, I think the public would definitely revolt in that case, because just
sure.
because JoJo is kind of like the closest thing to an institution that I can really think of in that
I mean,
regard.
Japan's got a lot of those for anime. I mean, One Piece is an institution now. So, yeah, I mean,
Well, at the same time, though, they do tons of the
I know
garbage
that's what
filler.
I'm saying. I think they can get away with it too, just because of that, because One Piece is an institution and it's allowed to do that. So,
Yeah.
who
Well,
knows?
on the other hand, though, that's what ended Bleach.
I think Bleach ended Bleach, to be honest.
Well, okay.
The manga was itself dying,
It's
Bleach
still
ended
going
Bleach.
somehow. I really don't know.
I mean, it's been on its last legs. Nobody gives a shit about Bleach anymore. Like,
I know it's
it's
great, but at the same time, I'm just amazed at how long it's limping through. I heard rumor that they're gonna try to do a final anime season of it, but I really
I
don't think anyone has the taste for dealing with that anymore.
I bet once they finish it, they'll do an anime season just because they'd probably be able to, if they did the numbers, like, we'd probably make enough to make a profit off this compared to some other random thing that nobody's heard of, which is probably the case.
Yeah,
So,
and then there's also Hunter x Hunter, which is one of those weird.
Hunter x Hunter is a very complicated story that we
Yeah,
probably for another time.
another time, but either way, anime scheduling is weird. Either way,
It's
so
interesting.
I'm excited for this. Anybody who has played Persona 4 is going to love Part 4 because basically Persona 4 cribs a huge amount from Part
Yeah.
4, for both good and bad, honestly. Like, well, I mean, the entire Persona series is filled with JoJo references. So, like, 4, I think in one of the spin off games, they explicitly have the characters do JoJo poses as a joke. So, it's very much aware of that.
Yep.
So let's get to our main topic then. We are going to be talking about the Tatami Galaxy. This is a animated series, 11 episodes. I think it was on the Noitamina block, if I
That's
remember.
correct.
It's at least at one point, was considered kind of like the late night artsy block, kind of.
That's totally dead now.
Yeah. I
The
mean,
block still exists, but it's just gone we just want some money now. Eh.
Yeah, I would say it's kind of like the Japanese equivalent of Adult Swim in certain ways. Like every once in a while, you'll get something like kind of brilliant on it now, and then there's a lot of stuff that I go,
I mean,
eh.
explicitly, Noitamina originally, as it was conceived, was supposed to be just atypical anime, like just basically trying to expand the audience beyond just the young male demographic.
Yeah,
Which they did a lot of that early on. A lot of that did a lot of josei works. Works for older women. They did a lot of that sort of work over its history, and they did a lot more experimental stuff. They did stuff like Princess Jellyfish, obviously. But
that was a great one. That's
yeah, but it's essentially shortly after Princess Jellyfish that it started skewing into just like really just weird stuff that was just kind of like, oh, like why is Guilty Crown a Noitamina series? This is just shonen-esque anime. Like why is Black Rock Shooter on here? It's like this is just, but
well, I think because it is a late night time slot, a lot of these series that kind of make use of the fact that they're late night kind of jumped onto the kind of Noitamina block to kind of use that.
yeah, but
So
that seems
you
like
get
that's
some
defeating the.
series that are yeah, it defeats the purpose.
I mean,
What
Ping
I'm
Pong
saying is
ended up on
it's
there, so hey,
hey,
but
well, yeah,
they occasionally get some good ones on there, But at the same time, they just also have a lot of shit that's just kind of like, man, why is this on here?
yeah.
Anyways,
It's no longer a seal of quality, but hey, every once in a while they'll do something good. So this ran on the Noitamina block back when it was still kind of fulfilling its initial promise. It is directed by Masaki Yuasa, so he is the one that directed Ping Pong, the really great episode of Adventure Time that actually for some reason just came on today. So really great timing. Mind Game. He also did. God, I mean, there's a lot of really small things that he's like put his hand into. Like Space Dandy, he had an episode. He did a lot of Crayon Shin-chan. We've talked about it before. His stuff's
yeah,
delightful.
we love them.
This is a. Would you say it's a light novel or just a novel
I think
adaptation?
it's just a novel.
Yeah, so this one's a novel adaptation. Again, 11 episodes. I think let's just go off with the kind of the basic premise. So
Well, can we real quick pause here? Hey, you person listening out here that just happens to listen to these episodes without watching shit.
oh,
Hey,
right.
you
You're gonna have to watch this stuff be first because
watch
like you
this
can't.
one.
Yeah, like
And I'm also gonna say right now, you should watch this. It's free to watch on like Hulu.
yes,
Just go ahead and watch it. If you're not able to get Hulu, you know what you got to do. But even beyond that, if you end up listening past this, don't let that stop you from watching this. I should actually encourage you to watch this because I'm just gonna say outright, this is a anime that is perfect for rewatching. This like gets better actually with more times through, and it's great the first time through.
for me, I am really glad that I have rewatched it a couple times now because it's almost necessary at times.
Mm.
One of the stylistic things that did kind of annoy me a little bit about it is he very much I think kept. I'm guessing what I'm assuming is the original very literary style of dialogue for the main character, and in order to pull that off, I and I think I'm pretty much right in this in that they actually sped up his readings mechanically. You can kind of hear, at least in certain episodes, and I remember near the end, I really noticed it where you get that kind of distortion in audio when you do a speed up or slow down. Like if you've ever used a podcast application that lets you listen to something at like 1.5 speed, it sometimes gets that little bit of distortion. And he has to say a lot of words in a very short amount of time, and I think they sped it up, and it's difficult. I mean, I speak the language, and it's still hard. And then with the subtitles, they're fast. These subtitles have to go very fast because they need to also capture that kind of slightly purple prose literary style in which he speaks. I At the same time, I love that aspect because it's really interesting. Like the way he describes things, it fits his kind of the main character's personality and also his kind of inherent defect really well. But at the same time, trying to understand it kind of gets frustrating at times.
It also contrasts a lot of the thing typical of other anime in the sense that the language tends to be exceedingly simplified. Actually,
Oh yeah,
that's one of the funniest things about people who learn to speak Japanese based off entirely anime in the sense that they sound like fucking dweebs because the language is not necessarily good conversational Japanese, or like even
Well, it's
like, you
not
know,
naturalistic in any
or
way.
sure, certainly,
Although
and it
this,
doesn't.
I think, goes in another direction where it
It's
reads just
certainly,
like their
yeah.
old, some of their literature. But again, it's I complain about it, but I completely understand, and I also appreciate its existence, if that makes sense.
Sure.
It's like, no, they had to do it, and I thought it was a right decision to keep that language, but that means they had to speed it up, but that also makes it kind of annoying where sometimes,
Honestly, I don't think they were speeding it up to like to fit it in. I think they were speeding it up for like, if
oh,
they
it would be
were.
horrible to listen to it at normal speed, though. Like
So yeah,
having to say the
well, I don't think
words.
they're doing that. I think they're doing that just because it's like it's supposed to be frenetic. Like this is the top of the head. You know, this is him not proclaiming this to it. This is him kind of like, this is his mental, you know, sort of like what how he's thinking. In
Well, at
my
the
book,
same
this
time,
is
by having it really fast, it almost feels kind of self-satirical in a weird way. Like it's kind of making fun of the nature of storytelling in that regard, and the way you treat it is because it's sped up. It's like yeah, let's get going, let's get going. It kind of it's like listening to someone telling that kind of story as opposed to the normal way in which we're used to hearing a story in which someone is it's you we usually kind of appreciate or give more accolades to people who do a languid, slower, kind of self-important kind of approach to storytelling by giving pauses and more dramatic stuff, whereas he's just like trying to get through it to the next thing, and that makes the audience feel it gives it a lighter tone, I think.
yeah. I really actually like the pace. I do respect the fact that people have a lot of issues with keeping up with it at times. Like I remember when we made a bunch of people watch this a couple of years ago, and you know people were like, "Whoa, God, this is so hard." It's like, and it's like, it's just kind of like, yo, guys, you gotta relax and watch it, and you have to rewatch it. That's cool too. It doesn't matter. It's fun.
Yeah, again, like it's one of those things where I go, there's lots of great movies and great art where there's an aspect of it that annoys me, but at the same time I go, it needs to annoy me in that way to accomplish what it's doing. And
Yeah,
so I take it as a part of that experience and also something that makes it good. Uh-oh.
No, sorry, that was my phone.
So I mean, again, so like I said, it's something that I felt slightly annoying, but I can't really complain about it because it's so necessary to what makes it interesting.
Yeah, I mean,
So
honestly, it doesn't annoy me at all. I love it.
yeah.
Like it has never annoyed me.
Well, there's only
Subtitles.
there's only certain times when it does because my I'm thinking it might annoy me in particular because I'm thinking in my head because when I watch a lot of stuff, I'm translating in my head while I'm also reading
Mhm.
subtitles, and I'm trying to see how the subtitlers kind of the way in which they translated certain words and expressions, and sometimes I'll catch errors or sometimes I'll go like, oh, that's a really interesting way of translating. So it might be something more specific to my experience watching this thing personally because of my background in language that I get a bit more frustrated than maybe someone else who can just much more easily absorb it and read it as it goes.
Sure.
So let's go into like I think what the basic premise is. So we have a unnamed protagonist. I think we could just call him Watashi, which in Japanese just means I, because he's
Yep.
never given a name and just mostly refers to himself. Who is, I would say, he's kind of an otherwise unremarkable slacker who has kind of delusions of grandeur and has a kind of odd moralistic side to him, and he is entering university and kind of wants to have in his mind a kind of perfect campus life or a perfect life in general. I think
Which he repeatedly restates as being a rose-colored
well,
life.
and rose colored is a if for people who had watched Hyoka is a kind of common set phrase. Like school life for high school students or college students in Japan. It's the rose colored life.
Yeah, I mean,
Barairo.
and that's honestly that's not a unheard of,
Well, it's
turn
like
of
we
phrase
have the
over
same
here.
phrase of looking through what's it called?
Rose-colored glasses.
Rose
Yeah,
colored glasses.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's like it's not a unheard of term over here.
Yes. So he is kind of chasing after this kind of idea, and the way it does it is it kind of goes through him picking a different kind of club activity, and in the hopes that that will lead him to this kind of nirvana of a perfect campus and a perfect just life in general.
And it's
And
specifically usually tied into him wanting to meet his ideal image of the one
raven-haired
true love.
woman.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
exactly.
at the same time, he says like, "Oh, I went in with the goal of making 100 friends," and as we find out, he is actually really terrible at socializing because he is. I don't want to call him a sociopath because he's not really, but at the same time, he's not. He
He's
doesn't
not well.
think normally. He
Well, the
doesn't
thing
think
is,
like other people do, but he
the funny thing
thinks he's
is that
normal.
the funny thing about that is that he's obsessed with this idea that he's not making friends. But the curious thing as we go on is the sense that so much of his issues are entirely in his point of view. And the
Yes.
interesting thing we even see with that initial problem about like, oh, he's not making any friends, you come to realize going on, is like, actually, he has actually a fair amount of friends. He just doesn't seem to recognize that
Or
fact
appreciate it.
or
Yeah.
appreciate them as being that. Like these people that he associates with regularly and like hangs out with, but it's kind of just like, oh, these are people dragging me down to some degree.
Well, because they are a deviation from the impossible ideal that he's holding
Yeah,
in.
absolutely.
And again, like one of the things I find is that he is, I would say, moralistic in an interesting way because he forms in various episodes kind of a an ethos or a philosophy that he kind of stumbles upon, and he forces himself to stick to it
Yep.
in the belief that this will result in his happiness. Well, spoiler alert, it doesn't, because he's rigidly holding on to a philosophy that is, the logical conclusion of it is kind of horrible.
Also, a lot of it, so much of it actually counters his own intrinsic personality because, as
Oh
you
yeah,
said,
he's forcing
he's
himself.
like he's got a very sort of dark humor secretly
Oh
that kind
yeah.
of contradicts his entire ideal, which kind of makes sense with the people that automatically end up being drawn to each time we revisit him, in the sense that it's always the same people that have the same sort of weird sense of humor and the same sort of weird interests. But it's the same sort of thing that pushes away people around him that he tries to be friends with, because of the normal people, his mental image of generic perfection. But it's also people that realistically bores him, but he just doesn't seem to recognize that.
Well, because he thinks society doesn't value them.
Yep.
So therefore, he makes the conclusion that, well, the society must be right. I think this brings us to the other really important character is Ozu, and I think in this case, kind of what Ozu represents is the kind of the Jungian shadow, the bête noire of this main character, where Ozu, as we find near the end, is very much a lot like him, and he shares very similar sense of humor, certain kind of, I would say, pranksterish sensibilities, but the protagonist does not want to admit that he is like that person
Absolutely.
because he's Ozu is not what people would say is conventionally attractive. He's not conventionally popular. He does also have some really negative aspects to him, but the main character is only focusing on those negative aspects, and he constantly says, like, oh well, my soul would be untainted if I wasn't exposed to this person.
Yeah, and it's the really interesting dynamic of this is the fact that Ozu is always like this subtle driving force behind everything and thing he blames, and he says, "Oh, Ozu's ruining my life." But then when you look back at it, it's like actually
It
he's
was
doing a
your
lot
damn
of fun
fault, damn
stuff
it.
with Ozu, and Ozu is very frequently bailing him out of trouble or getting him into positive circumstances. It's just that they've got a very just interesting and sort of different sort of relationship. It's not a very strictly straightforward sort of thing.
Well, it's one of those friendships where they do like each other, but they also don't like each other in certain ways.
I
But
I,
it's
I
well,
don't
no, actually, no, it's not even that. It's like kind of like a playfully combative relationship. I
absolutely.
think it's also mirrored in the fourth episode, the disciples wanted thing. Like
Hmm.
that is also a mirror of their relationship too between what's his name, Seitaro
Jogasaki.
Higuchi, and Jogasaki.
Yep.
They're friends, but they're also fated to kind of also combat each other, and the way they express their friendship is through this kind of back and forth, and that's
Mhm.
very similar to how the Watashi, the main character, and Ozu kind of interact unprompted. Like their conversations back and forth are very comedic, and they're very fun, but they're also kind of playfully barbed, remarks at each other in really, I think, smart, witty ways. But
Yep.
again, the main character, because this is not what I think the kind of the blandly nice relationship that he thinks he's supposed to value, he ends up kind of looking the other way and trying to seek out relationships that are ultimately unfulfilling. I think the other character, Akashi, the main female love interest in the series, is kind of similar in that she appreciates the kind of ozu-ness of the main character, like the fact that he isn't like everybody else. I mean, she almost practically states as such. And ironically, the main character, I think, in one of the repeated things is, I let out a silent salute saying, like, yes, Akashi, like, go on being yourself, in the face of other people. He ironically finds what's interesting about her is the fact that she doesn't really fit in, while at the same time he spends his whole time trying to fit in and seek after people who conventionally fit in. It's like this inherent contradiction of his character, and I think that's the overall, I would say it's the conflict, of the series. There's the inter-episode conflict, intra-episode conflict, of like the weird shit going on in each club, but the overall conflict of his character arc is kind of reconciling this inherent contradiction of how he views the world and how he behaves.
It's interesting that Akashi is such a important character in terms of like the actual resolution, but she actually features very minimally into a lot of the episodes, and it's actually not really the predominant like love interest that he's actually aiming for. Typically, it's someone that he kind of respects.
Yes,
but he also seems to think like, oh, I respect her so much that I'm not even going to try. Like he knows like he would like to, but at the same time, his own sort of mental ideal of like, oh no, I can't, I'm not, good enough. I can't even be bothered to even try. I'm not gonna, I respect her too much to even try to, acknowledge the fact that I really like her. He just refuses to even acknowledge the fact, even, throughout the entire thing. That's actually a big thing, is the fact that he refuses to acknowledge and grasp the opportunity that's right in front of him, as they repeatedly
well, they both say as not only just as a verbal thing but show as a visual metaphor constantly.
Like, there's a literal visual thing that he needs to grasp and take advantage of in front of him in order to pursue a relationship with Akashi.
Yeah, and there's a fortune-telling character that just constantly changes it. I kind of like the slightly fourth wall breaking moments where he kind of goes like, have you raised your prices? Or like, oh, you're shortening what you usually say. Like, there's a couple little moments like that I thought were really good gags, but they don't break it. They're just nice little asides.
See, I don't know. See, with that is like, it's actually an interesting question whether the fortune teller is actually cognizant of what's going on or not, or if it's a kind of a joking sort of like
no, she's aware, because there's a couple episodes where the times she does deviate from her normal spiel are kind of specific to like, oh, you're fucking up this time, man. Like there are a couple of moments where her spiel is way different.
Well,
but it's almost like, but she's basically saying like, this is not how it's usually going.
Well, you could easily take that, though, as being like a sort of dramatic irony as well, though. Rather, it's kind of a...
Well, she also raises her prices, and it's great.
Sure, but it's more the sense like you could use it as like a kind of comedic dramatic irony rather than actually being her cognizant. It's more just, hey, it's a jokey element about, the whole fact that nobody is aware that there's a loop, but at the same time, there is one.
Well, not until the end.
Well, sure. And nobody's cognizant of it ultimately until Watashi at the end. But even then, it's kind of like there are tips of the hat, and they sort of nods towards that fact. Like, there's lots of weird, funny callbacks to like, oh, I hear so and so is involved with this. Like, huh, sort of thing. Like, oh, not so much an outright sort of thing like acknowledging that there's loop, but acknowledging that there's a consistency and that there's
in the world,
diversions as well.
There is constants that exist in that world. So like,
and there's also diversions though.
Yeah. Well, so let's go into the premise. So what happens is each time he's in a certain club or circle or situation, usually at the end of the episode he goes, like, what a horrible mess everything's turned up into. If only I did this other thing, then everything would have worked out. And the episode ends with the clock and the whole episode being undone, and then the next episode is him picking a different club or a different choice, and then continuing at that, finding himself unsatisfied. The series uses a really great, I think, repetition is a really powerful thing in this, because it's one of the it's an interesting use of it, because like what happens is by doing the kind of the cyclical aspect, it establishes kind of rules of the world, but also I think it helps develop the other characters around it, in the sense that like certain characters will change depending on the main character's different choice of circle, but there's certain aspects that remain the same no matter what his choice is. So it basically, by having this repetitive pattern and seeing how characters either deviate or stay the same, it shows us and demonstrates to us what are the endemic aspects to these characters that are kind of a universal constant.
Sure.
So, and it kind of also is, it's a nice little thing on Fate. So let's go through kind of like the basic thing. So he starts off with the tennis circle, and it's the first episode, and I think it spends a lot of time kind of establishing what we're going to be seeing repeated a few times, in terms of like, what the pattern is, because it kind of speeds up those repetitive parts as it goes, because it doesn't
Well,
have
the
to.
the other interesting thing I think we need to keep in mind is that these episodes are all actually covering 3 whole years of time,
Yes.
which is actually very like the thing is they typically cover the first year within like 30 seconds typically. That's where
Oh
stuff
yeah,
immediately
because
falls
he
apart.
constantly believes himself to have wasted the previous 2 years.
Yep.
So in Tennis Circle, he meets Ozu. He does not do well in terms of socializing with the club, and he sees all these other people getting into pairs and becoming couples. And he and Ozu end up finding ways to drive like wedges between all these other couples because they know like secret info about them, and they kind of leak it out. It kind of culminates in them launching fireworks at the couples watching the Obon event and things like that. Like he does this ethos. He develops this philosophy of kind of like a anti-romantic kind of viewpoint, and that's kind of what keeps him from ending up grabbing the opportunity of Akashi in front of him, because he had recovered something that she had lost, and totally, it's a great way for him to kind of start a conversation and kind of get himself into her life. He almost thinks about it, but then he goes, "No, this would go against who I am and who I've decided to be." So like that's the big thing in the first one, and he ends up falling into a river, being after he and Ozu have been rightfully kind of reviled by everybody for doing the shit that they've done, and he decides, okay, I want to try again. So then the next time around, he's in the film circle called Misogi, where we run into one of the other recurring characters that you've mentioned earlier, Masaki Jogasaki. And this is one of my favorite episodes just because I think like it has some of the most grotesquely funny moments near the end.
Yeah.
Um, it's in the film circle, it's pretty much run by this. I don't know if this phrase is still popular anymore, but they call it like Peter Pan syndrome in certain colleges, where people will take a fifth or sixth year of college, but this guy's in his eighth year.
Well,
And
the whole thing they say is that his grades are in fact actually just outright terrible. Him and the other person we usually talk will end up talking about, Sitaro Higuchi.
yeah, and so what he does though is, and he kind of just runs this whole club with kind of like an iron fist, but using the kind of his good looks and his personality, and also just being kind of a somewhat hard liner in a lot of ways. And he has kind of taken it over and kind of takes all the resources, whereas the main character is doing all these kind of offbeat films, but he can't get any support. He can't get the editing room. He can't get the equipment. So he and Ozu are doing that, and then finally, he just can't take it anymore. And so Ozu kind of gives him the idea to do this, I guess, a hit piece on him by sabotaging his movie, and they record all this horrible, weird secrets to this main character. Sorry, to this Jogasaki guy, and like in the
Some
final.
of it is true about, downsides of his personality, and some of it is completely made up as well, from what they imply.
Or at least what they
The details are twisted to make it as worse
even
than
more
possible.
worse than that they really were.
Yep.
So like he has, it's implied he kind of has a cleanliness semi OCD thing. So like when he accepts gifts from girls, like they show him just dropping in the garbage and washing his hands right away. There's footage of him taking a shit, like as if he forgot that there was a camera on him, so it follows him running into the bathroom
Yep.
afterwards.
And of course, the big thing here is that also that he actually has a love doll.
Yeah. Well, there's also like send me money, mommy, and like he drinks like the milk from the baby bottle, and he has the wall of boobs, like he's this pervert.
Yep.
Again, all this stuff, and it and here's the thing is, and this was I think one of the great moments is that this is the episode that really goes, okay, I see why Akashi kind of likes him, because she states it a bit more clearly here. It goes, I kind of liked the fact that you were doing these senseless dumb films than you were doing this thing.
Yeah, because she in fact did not respect his hit piece at all, kind of sort of thing, you know.
Well, she was
Though
always
she
the
also
only one who laughed at his movies. Like she was
yeah
the only one that appreciated them or acknowledged them at all. Like
the other funny thing about that I think is the fact that she also immediately knew that it was him that actually made that film.
yeah.
So it's kind of like a very telling sort of thing, like, oh, this is clearly him who made this, but at the same time. And I think this the very interesting thought of this, and the very interesting thing part of these works is that we have all these separate arcs looking at different clubs that the protagonist Watashi is getting involved in. But at the same time, as we go on, we see the fact that Ozu is actually involved in every single club in some way, and anything that involves Ozu as a plot line seems to be happening in the background, regardless of whether or not Watashi's involved with it. In the sense that
Well, we
during
see
this,
that in the ninth episode, like kind of why.
well, yeah, but in
Yeah.
this one in particular, we see the fact that Ozu is helping, pushing him to actually do this hit piece, and he's working with some guy that he calls his master, Sitaro Higuchi. But then we discover later on in the next arc, essentially, or episode, that basically that Higuchi is involved in a proxy war, as they say it.
Well, it's the episode after the next one.
Sure,
The next
but
one's the
with
cycling thing where we see
yeah.
that Ozu's involved in, yet another activity of stealing bikes and selling them for cash.
Sure, but anyways, but the fact that this is all tied into this ongoing prank, and the thing is, none of these characters are really changing between arcs when we see other aspects of them. Is the interesting thing here that I want to call attention to. Is like we're seeing different sides of them when Watashi is meeting and being exposed to different sides of them. We're not actually seeing different events like, oh, look all these different ways that Jogasaki's changed based off of how that he's, you meet him, this plot line is completely different because Watashi's weird. It's like, no, not really, because the whole thing with him being exposed for having a love doll happens in every plot line or every episode as it turns out. We just don't see it because it's not typically relevant.
Yeah,
So,
there's certain constants, not just to the characters, but certain events that will always play out no matter what the
yes,
main character.
largely driven by Ozu.
And I think they do a comment on this here in the penultimate episode where, it's like we like to think of the multiverse as having, absolute infinite possibilities. But in this case, there actually are a limited set of possibilities. I think in one of the things is Higuchi says, like, could you become a superhero and fly? Well, that's not actually a possibility, even though we like to entertain the idea that that's a universal possibility somewhere in an alternate universe. Whereas this series, it kind of goes like, no, there's certain things that are just going to be impossible, and the amount of multiverse things is actually, it's many, but also limited, and you just kind of have to roll with it. And the main character is refusing to roll with it. He wants the infinite possibilities, and he's not understanding that he doesn't have, godlike control over his reality. But he wants it! He wants it so bad! So the third episode is the bicycling club, and we kind of see Ozu as even more of a nefarious character, and that he's involved in yet another thing.
He's outright a crim.
And the main character, in this one, this was, I think, him being the dumbest of the episodes, where they literally tell him, like, don't do anything, don't change. We just need you to physically be like this thing in order to fly this, kind of glider that we've done. And of course, he fucks it up.
Well, that's the funny thing is that this is like one time where he's like,
is entirely his fault.
Well,
Like,
no, the funny thing is that it's largely happening because he gets inspired to be a better person. But at the same time,
it's
that's
also
what actually
hollowly at the same time.
yeah, but that's what ultimately screws him over. And it's kind of like, oh, but it's funny that that's how it plays out.
Well, it's kind of like he in this one he actually tries to kind of pursue Akashi, but he does it in the wrong way. Whereas in the other times he just chooses not to pursue her. In this case, he's like, oh, she wanted me to fly this thing, therefore I'm going to try to impress her by becoming physically athletic, even though they had told him explicitly, like, we need this designed for your current, physicality. So, like, instead of pursuing her like the fortune teller and the entire series is telling him to do so, he has just done it in the dumbest way possible, and he only has himself to blame in this regard.
Mm-hmm.
So then the fourth episode is the one you mentioned, called Disciples Wanted, where we kind of get a little bit more background on Sitaro Higuchi, the guy with the strange chin, who is in this proxy weird prank war with Masaki Jogasaki. And this is the kind of one that really mirrors the relationship between Ozu and the main character in a lot of ways. So in this one, instead of joining a club, he just becomes a disciple along with Akashi and Ozu of this strange man who kind of just has free reign, and turns out he's been also at the university for 8 years just doing his own thing, and also has a friend who is what's her name, Ryoko Hanuki, who's a dentist who has already graduated 4 years ago, but she is a classmate of them.
Yep. And the interesting thing about Higuchi is that Higuchi is an interesting sort of parallel also in the sense that he actually has a pretty good worldview that the protagonist eventually has to kind of move towards, in the sense that, sure, he's kind of, quote unquote, thrown his life away,
But
but
he
at the same
appreciates
time,
everything around him.
he appreciates everything around him, and he does things just in a nonchalant sort of way that is just kind of like he's just enjoying life in his own weird way. It's not a life that anybody should idealize. It's not a life that anyone should try to copy.
Or at
but
least
it's his life.
conventionally is not idealized. So
Sure.
like on a certain philosophical level, he is the ideal. He is kind of like the absolute freedom of individuality in a certain way, or at least, freedom within certain confines, but he's the idea of freedom and kind of stopping and smelling the roses. It's just that he does not live a life that conventional society by any means would say, like, this is something worthy.
I mean, it's not even necessarily a healthy life, if that's something
no.
you're particularly aiming for. But just a sense of like, he knows where he's at, and he's fine with it. He's not thinking about like, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that, I need to do this now, oh, I'm wasting my life. He just goes and lives his life, not necessarily by the moment in like a sort of like hedonistic standpoint, but he lives his life as he sees fit, and he's fine with how his life's turned out.
Yeah. So he's kind of like the antithesis of the main character, at least for most of the series. I think the main character ends up becoming a little bit more like Ozu, but with a little bit less darkness. I would say.
I don't know.
Well, he kind of
with
literally...
Ozu, it's hard to say. The funny thing about towards the end is like, it's hard to say how much of that is actually in Watashi's head, other than like skewing things to be in a certain standpoint. Because one of the interesting things,
Ozu still does some terrible things to achieve his goal, but he has an oddly laudable goal. Like he still
the biggest thing that he does that is bad is that he steals that blimp.
Well, no, but he also sells those guides, and
sure,
again, he does all sorts of kind of nefarious stuff, and kind of like fucks with other people constantly for his joy. But at the same time, a lot of it is for, as it is eventually revealed, for a person that he is in love with. But at the same time, he's kind of stepped on other people to get to that point. So he's not entirely evil, but he's also not entirely good either. So so I just want to make sure that yes, in the end, his character is kind of, I think, recovered in the eyes of the series in a sense, because the series adopts the main character's perspective, and he is basically the best friend that the main character really has, which he realizes. But at the same time, that does not it does not render him innocent of certain things that he has done. I mean, that's why he ends up with like the broken leg and people chasing after him and shit.
Yep.
So let's see. I'd say the episode after the disciple thing is, I think, one of the more disturbing episodes, because the way it portrays this cult is kind of realistic and creepy.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of thing, though. I think it's one of the least ultimately important ones in terms of the actual character side of things, where it's more just interesting in the sense of, well, I mean, we get to see a standpoint of Watashi, where it's basically him interacting with these super positive, super happy members of the softball circle. They're just all talking about these like sort of meaningless like conversations that don't actually say much of anything,
or there are these opinions that are so scrubbed clean of anything that they're just saying something kind of transparently good but without any substance.
Sure. I mean, and it's also very important, of course, for like tying in for some of Ozu's interactions where we meet his actual love interest, essentially.
Well, we also see him steal the blimp to try to see her
well,
for the first
to
time.
try to meet her, and that sort of thing.
Well, the reason I think this episode is important is because I think it does something thematic. I think the characters, the people that are in this cult, or at least the way they behave when they're in this, the softball circle and being kind of nicey nice, they represent what the main character thinks is the type of person that society values, that he should be kind of more like, in a sense, which is why I think he gets, they show him not believing really in what the cult is saying. Like when he goes to the meeting, he doesn't really believe in that, but he believes in being the type of person that everybody else thinks is so nice.
And it's also interesting we see it in the sense of him like trying to engage in the conversations they have, but everything he says is just like so disturbing to them that they just kind of disregard it.
But at the
They're
same
kind of
time,
like,
they disregard it, but then they still kind of go like, "Well, no, see, it's our fault for trying to, like they're still being nicey nice, but not really.
but it's also
Like it's
but
all
it's nice.
fake."
It's niceness without any actual like heart to it, or
Oh,
like
it's basically kind of like the niceness equivalent of like hollow pity. It's
sure.
kind of like there's something kind of called a phatic expression
Mm,
where it's like when you ask someone like, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" or "Hey, like how's the weather?" You don't actually care, but you're saying that because you feel like you have to say something in that situation, but you don't really care what the other person says. Like you're saying words to say words or to fulfill the social contract. You're just doing it to check off the checklist. Like so that's kind of what these characters in this club trade in is all the stuff that you're supposed to do. Like you're supposed to be nice all the time. You're supposed to say certain things. You're supposed to believe certain things. Like they even have the moment where that all just breaks down and people kind of reveal what they're actually thinking and feeling, and then they just use that as a way to go right back to go being the way they were before.
yep.
So I feel that like while maybe character wise it's not a really important one, but I think it reveals a bit about the kind of fake ideology that the main character is kind of subscribing
Sure.
to throughout the series, and that he somehow believes this fakeness is what society really wants from him when in fact it's not really. Like he's mistaking that for the kind of like platonic pure value of
Sure.
something.
So after this episode, the thing we saw was a interesting episode where it's actually three sort of things happening in total parallel at the same time that diverge at a singular point towards the end, where we're actually
Yes.
just seeing certain aspects of the way because he basically joins three clubs at the same time. He joins an English conversational one, a heroes show association circle, and a reading circle about a kind of a book club.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of like it. The thing is that involved in all these is basically we also start seeing a lot of the different sides of all the major, peripheral cast, where we
All
see a lot of different aspects of people that we just did not see whatsoever. And we also see Ozu from three different angles simultaneously in the sense that there's not actually much changing except towards the end where he makes a different choice between, three girls and all of them failing very badly, not so because he made a bad choice, but because the way he
Well, they
actually
were
went
never
through
a well, they were also never a choice to begin with.
sure, to some degree, yes, and that's a lot of them to do with his delusion, but it's also the entire reason why he went in that direction just was so much of it has to do with his bad, sort of mindset on everything still.
Well, to be fair, I have to appreciate that he does say. So in one situation, we learn more about Ryoko Hanuki, who's the
Yep.
dentist character, and he at least, which is I wish more people would do this kind of decision making in everyday life, where he goes, "She's wasted. I shouldn't do this."
Sure.
Like he actually goes through and he says like, "No, wait, this it would be the most wrong thing possible to take advantage of this." And in none of the things he ever actually go through with it.
I
And I'm
mean, it's
like,
the thing is like it's not him making like bad decisions on the top level. It's also a sense of like his entire philosophy for approaching like
oh,
all
well,
these
even
different
getting into
interests
those
is wrong.
situations, he made some bad decisions.
Yeah.
Again, like the closest thing he has to like a decent kind of at least a friendship in this case is with the Hanuki character.
Yep.
Um, so in this one, the three different girls, and in this case, here's the thing: is we also barely see Akashi until the end of the third episode of this arc.
Mhm.
She is not actually one of the three girls that he thinks he's pursuing. So we have one who is the dentist character who's a bit older than him and is fairly. I don't want to say flirtatious. She's just very open, and a lot of people I think would misinterpret the way she interacts with people.
Mhm.
So there's her. Then there is Jogasaki's doll character Kaori, the real doll, but is so kind of elegantly cared for, and the main character is so kind of I don't want to say warped. He's not really warped, but he's just kind of so alienated that he ends up forming this attachment to her.
I mean, a lot of it's him like sort of internalizing Jogasaki's own sort of like relation, like approach to it in the sense of like,
Well, he creates a relationship that he can't possibly be hurt by.
yes,
And that becomes his appealing thing. Like, he can't do or say the wrong thing. He can't really be punished for it from, well, okay, he can be punished by society, but he can't be punished by the girl because
He can be punished by Jogasaki.
yeah, well, but that's what I mean. Is that he can't be
Sure.
punished by the girl. He can be punished otherwise. But in a lot of plays, people are very scared of when you put affection onto another person, they feel that they're giving a burden of responsibility for the other person to either return their feelings or to behave properly to the other person, to not have it kind of blow in their face. In this case, this doll represents kind of, again, this weird philosophically almost like platonic ideal, but in reality it's really horrible and dumb. But on paper or philosophically, you could almost argue that it is the perfect relationship, but only because it's entirely one-sided. So
Yep.
psychologically, it appeals to him. And then the last one is the Keiko Higuchi, who is a person that he started a correspondence with, and it starts off actually pretty well-meaning, but then as he kind of builds his ideal self, it exaggerates from reality, and he goes, he creates the person he wants to be for this person, and it turns out to be like oh, I lived in America and all this other stuff, and I think a lot of it is an expression of what he kind of wants to do with his life, but would never really be able to do so. So he ends up writing letters to her, and so she ends up making an ultimatum saying, like, I need to finally meet you. Of course, surprise, surprise, and I think that the show does a whole bunch of foreshadowing of this in a lot of ways. Like, they mention the where kind of like the address of the letters is, then they mention, and what's her name? Hanuki mentions where Ozu lives, like the apartment complex in that area, and it's like that's really explicitly stated, I think, even in the second episodes. But it turns out this girl is actually Ozu the whole time. I mean, he's the one that gave him the book and the address. I mean, it's very obvious to everyone but the main character. But the thing that's revealed is that Ozu gave up after, I think, like within the first year of writing the letters, and just gave it to Akashi to write, and she just kind of felt like continuing it. It was kind of, I thought that was a really great thing of her character, just to continue doing this, but because she really wanted to, and she just
The other interesting thing about it is the sense that, like, Watashi's big issue here was the fact that he was constructing a character about himself in this this kind of thing that he's conveying. But at the same time, in order for Akashi to be actually taking up her own end of it, she's also doing the same thing. So
yeah.
even though Watashi is that much like ashamed about what he's doing, it's like not really, because it was like a double-sided sort of thing, and it's like kind of like
she says like, well, I was lying too, so whatever.
It's like kind of her standpoint of it was kind of more like, oh, it's this goofy thing, and also I actually respect you a lot, because the other thing we hear with him being involved in that hero association club was that he actually like ended up being backing her up when she was getting like kind of hit on,
kind of like assaulted
when she was still in high school, actually.
Yeah, because she's 1 year before him.
Yep.
And then he also didn't directly try to use that opportunity. He just kind of
he immediately just walks away, because he refuses, because he has this mental idea like, no, that's not right. He's got this ideal notion about how these things should play out, when who cares that it's not real life? It's real life. It's not fiction. You don't need to do things along a certain like dramatic narrative. And that's one of these big things that really just kind of gives him trouble, is that he has this idea in his head, and even when he sees there's a perfect chance right in front of him, he's like, no, it's not
good
right.
enough. It's perfect is the enemy of good in his case.
Exactly. And also the sense that, like, he's got this idea that it's wrong not to do things in this proper sort of way, where doing things outside the bounds of that box is outright bad. Not that it's not something that, he wants to do things perfectly. He feels like he needs to, because otherwise he'll be violating some sort of like rule on society. Japan and Japanese society has a big thing about, sort of just fitting within the lines, very much complying and sort of things. You don't want to stick out too much. And it seems like there's a sort of element of that to this, in the sense of like, nobody can actually live within that bounds. Like, that might be an ideal, but it's not the case of how people actually live their lives. Like, life isn't clean like that.
Well, it's almost kind of like he wants to live in a narrative. Like he wants to live in a story, like something where all the pieces come together and they form something very clear. Whereas in real life, things are chaotic and you don't see the cause and effect relationship clearly. But it's almost kind of like he wants things to play out the way you see in TV shows and movies. And I think he kind of makes a couple of references to, like, if a TV character, this is the kind of thing that would happen then. That's what's setting his strange ideal. Like,
And a lot of this also ties, of course, in the fact that he's clearly got some anxiety issues. He's sort of paralyzed by self-doubt. He just, rather than seizing opportunities that he can clearly do, he instead just kind of goes back to his room and sort of just the peace and sort of protection of his room. And he sort of just stews in the fact that, oh, as long as I don't make a decision, everything will be okay. I won't have to deal with failing by not trying to succeed.
Yeah, well, there's one episode right before that where he kind of goes.
Well, I'm not saying that particularly. It's like every episode he sort of does that.
Yeah, I mean, he does the extreme a little bit later. So
yeah,
but
every episode, like, he sort of always his
yeah.
room is always his retreat, and he always sorts of just rejects like everything. The thing is that. Well, I'll save the one little short sort of thing, but yes. So with these three, we basically only see these three episodes. We only see sort of divergences towards the end, where he goes after a certain option, where it's like, okay, these three girls, I've got this chance, in this one direction. But every time he sort of doesn't go far enough, or he realizes that he's going the wrong way, and he makes the poor decision, or ultimately, as with one where it's basically he had a perfect chance with Akashi. He at the same time just refuses to accept that it's like real, or that his anxiety just kind of
he
stops
didn't
him.
want it to work out that specific way.
Yeah,
it didn't play out like the letter writing thing is not how he wanted it to work if it was going to happen.
I mean, the funny thing about these three episodes is that they also involve him having conversations with his inner libido frequently.
Oh yes, Johnny, who is portrayed as this kind of cowboy, and then the visual metaphor of him in a hamster wheel.
For him being like turned around on, and essentially, and they often use it a little after this as well as like a symbol for like just like jokingly saying like, oh, he's masturbating right now.
Oh yeah, that's what I mean, him in the hamster wheel.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And the interesting thing with that is that he actually has a thing with like Johnny, and like the end of the reading circle thing where like Johnny is, or the one where he's she has a chance with Akashi, where it's like even if that whole thing was awkward, she clearly was okay, it didn't actually matter. Why are you walking away? Like, even his own internal, like, sort of, like, sense, something that's been very out of control and sort of leading him in the wrong way frequently, is like, hey, you're making a bad decision, not just for me, but in general.
But the main character is so rigid. Again, he's very ethical in that weird way, where he grabs an ethos and he just fucking sticks to it. And so he goes against that kind of common sense or his own feelings because he feels he has to stick to that.
Sure.
And then I think in the next episode, though, is where he decides, you know what, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to abandon all possible ethos and just completely exploit everything and try to live that way. So he kind of follows almost the Ozu path of sorts.
He follows the Ozu path, but at the same time, he doesn't actually get much pleasure out of it, which is the interesting thing.
That's the whole point.
So basically, Watashi gets involved with a secret society, the Lucky Cat Chinese restaurant, which is involved in all this sort of criminal enterprise.
And we find out why Ozu has been a part of the different clubs, what he's been doing in the different clubs.
That's part of the reason why he's been involved with all the different clubs, because what we kind of also find out is that Ozu has reasons for doing things that he does that are sometimes nefarious, but at the same time, he's also doing them simply for the pleasure of it, not necessarily from a hedonistic standpoint, but just kind of like, this seems like this would be fun. Let's do it and have fun doing it. Because this is something like he ends up scolding, Watashi during all of this, in the sense of like, hey, you're having issues doing, your stuff as part of the secret, criminal society at times. You don't seem like you're having very much fun with it. Why should this necessarily matter? You should just, just have fun with it. It's like, whatever. And it's like, but even in this, Watashi has a obsession about how being bad and ignoring his ideals should be idealized. Like, oh, I need to be being promoted constantly. I need to go all the way to the top.
Yeah. So like even abandoning like the morality, he still has an ideal somehow.
Yeah.
Like there's a rigidity to him that is just not able to function like this. So then after even this fails, he finally decides, and I think you mentioned in reference to earlier.
Before we do this real quick, I want to one of the most interesting things about this particular episode is that we see him getting involved in all this criminal enterprises, kind of like it gives you this impression that he's obsessed with like this actual sort of club and all this stuff that you think they'll be pushing him away from people. But at the same time, we also see him interacting with a lot of the side characters that kind of establish the fact that actually, even when he's doing this, he's still friends with all the major characters. Like he's like
Yeah.
involved in all this nefarious stuff, but sort of like Ozu, like it's not. He's just not really accepting the fact that even doing scummy ass shit, he's still having good relationships with people. Like he knows like Akashi, he does some shitty stuff to her in this, but he still knows her, and she's more pissed, not pissed off on what he's doing, but more the sense that he's like being kind of heartless. And then,
Well,
but
he's not living up to what she sees in him.
sure, and at the same time, like he's still friends with Higuchi. He's still friends with Hanuki. And so it's like he actually has like a thing where he's like drinking with her at one point. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like, oh, so apparently, regardless of all the different diversions, like we're the ways that we actually see all these different aspects of the main character, even when he's going in completely different interactions, just shows how like he's at his core, he is the same person. Even when he's trying to change things, he's so busy trying to fight himself. And this kind of pays off at the end of this, where he has a thing with Higuchi, where Higuchi basically explains to him exactly what's wrong with his philosophy.
Yeah. It's great. It's
Where,
actually
where, it's,
really good.
where it's interesting in the sense like he's basically like, you're so obsessed with pursuing a rose-colored campus life when there's nothing rose-colored in this world. And
Yes.
the thing he says is that everything is a bunch of colors mixed up, the good, the bad, but it's all basically fun. And it's like, he never really is like wasting his life in all these things that he's wasting his life at. He's just living a life, and he's just so obsessed with this just rules and how he thinks it should play out that he's just completely missing it.
Yeah.
And then after this, basically this one where things go horribly wrong regardless, he basically is shocked by the fact that Ozu is living this like throughout all this while Ozu's doing all these terrible things and stuff. Ozu is actually pursuing and living the life that he wants to live, where he's actually having this ideal thing with like the woman that in the previous arc he kind of idealized, the daughter of that cult essentially, where it's basically like he's doing all these things to live his life, which to him is kind of breaks him to a certain degree in the sense of like, oh, Ozu is everything I should want to be, but it's so contrary to his mental image of Ozu that he basically decides that I give up on everything. I'm never going to leave my room. I'm not going to try anything. And that gives us into the sort of the thing that's actually named after the books, the 4.5 Tatami Ideologue, which is the name of the actual, and then, the Tatami Galaxy, what we actually named it. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting at this point where they actually start pulling back and kind of show this is kind of like they reveal the fact that this isn't just a sort of narrative element. There is an actual mechanic involved here. They don't explain how it
Or
works.
why. It just is. You just have to accept
It might
it.
be involved the fortune teller. We don't know, but basically he gets stuck in this endless loop of his different tatami rooms that he lives in. Is basically his apartment, and
Well, they're
because he
different
chose his
iterations
life.
of his life.
Yeah, and basically he chose to not leave his room ever in this particular iteration, and he just goes through these rooms ultimately after and ties in some certain elements that didn't necessarily make sense in other ones by interacting with other people's rooms. But the interesting thing here is that he kind of comes to realize and learn about all these characters around him by choosing instead about to reflect on all the different individual versions of his own life and more to reflect that on his relationships with other people, the relationships that in this particular time he didn't actually have because he completely spent 3 years essentially doing nothing with his life.
Well, basically what happens is he ends up learning, again, he learns those constants. He learns about, he learns to think about the good people around him because he has in this iteration, because he had nothing, he learns to appreciate what his other selves had but weren't able to see because this version of him is so deprived.
Yeah, I mean, and even ultimately realizes and actually touches on some funny ways. Like he really wished he had like someone that would be mean to him when he was doing dumb stuff. As a joke. Like he comes to realize that Ozu is his actually only true friend, really,
Yeah.
or his best friend in the sense of like Ozu is like a real reflection of him as a person. They've got very similar personalities and like they have very similar lives and what in terms of how they approach things. Like there's a thing that often touched on like in earlier episodes, where he comments like if he hadn't met Ozu, his campus life would have been a good one.
He says that his soul would be untarnished. Yeah.
Sure. And in this one, he said that he basically said like if I had met Ozu, my campus life would have been a fun one. Because basically, we realized that at this point is that every single loop, he ultimately meets the same people because these are, in fact, people that like him as a person.
Yeah.
Like Ozu isn't just picking him up just because like Ozu is just naturally inclined to just ruin his life in particular. Ozu is honestly his friend. Like he helps him very frequently. Like in
Well,
the one
also
where there's
relates to
involved.
him. Like they both, again, as we find out in the last episode, they both have a similar humor sensibility.
Sure, and they both prank each other. The thing is that
But not even, but
that
not, but it's like they prank each other, but not even out of like because of the proxy war, but just because that's how they relate to each other.
sure, and it's also just the fact that it's just their personalities. Like it's fun just to mess with people sometimes.
Yeah.
Like I have it's like I can relate to this to some degree because I have
Well,
friendships
it's a
that are like these.
mischievousness that a lot of people have.
Sure, and
Yeah.
I can relate to this. I have mailed people boxes full of ladybugs before.
Yeah.
Why? I don't know. It seemed funny.
Well,
it
it
was
is,
really
because
funny
you
when they
can
call
and it's
you up and
harmless.
they're like, "What?" It's really funny when they call you up and go, "What the fuck did you do?" At the same time, they realize that it's a pain in the ass, but it's also really funny. Like that's just the relationship that some people have. Like that is a type of that is some people's personalities, and that personally I can really relate to that sort of mindset. And it's just interesting that he really comes to realize during all this sort of loops is that his lives weren't perfect, but they were all great.
in
They
different
were
ways.
all
Yeah.
great, fun lives. And the only thing really holding him back during those lives, even when he was struggling with his own problems, is ultimately the mindset that was, dragging him down. Because he was actually having very good lives. It's just all his mindset that was driving him wrong at the little very end, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, he just wasn't realizing he refused to take the good with the bad. That's kind of I think what it was is that he wanted just good. He was not willing to accept the bad, but at the same time, then that caused him to become obsessed with the bad to the point where he wasn't seeing the good because
I don't even
he was
know.
trying to spend his he was spending his alternate times trying to scrub all the bad out of his life that he just only saw the bad, therefore he didn't see. It's kind of like he was trying to clean his kitchen, but he only saw the dirt. He didn't see that the rest of the kitchen was good.
The thing is, it's not even like the fact that he's not. It's not even so much that he's not accepting that there's going to be bad stuff. It's also the fact that he is taking the bad stuff as being so utterly just the
It
things that he's
spoils
actually
it
taking
for
as
him.
bad. They are not actually really that bad.
Well, he thinks
They're
they spoil the life somehow.
Sure. Well, it's just also the sense of like so much of the things that actually go wrong are really interesting. And the thing is, like, there are interesting aspects to your life. Like, I'm sure we all can agree that life doesn't necessarily go the way you think it should at times. But the thing is that if you learn to roll with it, life becomes a lot more amenable and more acceptable. If you learn to, take failure on the chin and kind of find it funny and sort of like accept it and kind of learn to live with it. Not even just live with it, but actually internalize it in the sense of like making the bad actually into good. Not in like a kind of like ultimate optimism at all times, but sort of like the sense of like how like Higuchi takes it, where things go wrong sometimes for Higuchi. Like even with like this proxy war, him getting pranked isn't a bad thing. Like someone releasing a cockroach cube in his apartment, which is fucked
Oh
up.
yeah,
A cube of cockroaches is fucked
that
up.
was a great
That
visual.
happens.
Again, like it goes without saying. The visuals in the show are just
Well, that's something we're going to have to touch on because we haven't really
yeah.
touched on yet, but we'll get to that. In the sense of like, that's a terrible thing to have happen to you, but is it really that bad? Like, yes, it sucks,
But it's also
but
an
at the same time, you think
experience. Like it's an experience.
it's an
no one else
experience,
would have.
exactly.
Well, so basically,
Yeah.
what you're arguing is not for what someone would call like Panglossian optimism, where it's kind of a false optimism of just accepting everything as like everything's perfect, everything's fine.
It's not. I'm not gonna go say this is the best of all worlds or
Yes,
anything
exactly.
here.
So like, but what you're arguing is that when you stop viewing your life through this is what it should be, this is what it should be. Why isn't it? Why isn't it the way it should be? Once you stop doing that, you're able to at least so you're not just miserable all the time because you're thinking about the way how things are not meeting up to this impossible ideal. And it's not about necessarily saying like, aim low, kids, that way you won't be disappointed. It's not that either. It's about
It's aim high, and if things don't go your way, just keep doing stuff that you feel is
or take stock of what
right.
is good. It's a
Yeah,
it's a
exactly.
very overall, I think, again, because of the main character through until the very end has this kind of, again, when I say ethical, I mean that he holds onto a given philosophy or ethos very rigidly. The entire series is about like, well, you can't really live that way to a satisfactory degree. You can't live in a pure ideal. Like, you just can't. Human beings do not function that way, and you can't be happy that way. And I think that's kind of what it is. It's almost like somewhat take a more moderate view to your life and to your worldview. Is, I think, kind of what the overall message, or at least the theme, seems to be, at least near the end.
I think a lot of also the other thing at the end is that like the whole thing is basically he ultimately breaks out of this loop after being essentially in his like stuck in this Tatami Galaxy, as they literally very overtly term it, in the sense of being stuck in all these rooms after like 2 months of being stuck in there. And the interesting thing is that after he breaks out, he basically is totally accepted the fact that he doesn't care about how things look. He doesn't care really about how things perceive. He just wants to live his life, and basically he wants to embrace, like, the thing they repeatedly say, embrace the opportunity in front of you. He's not thinking about things like, oh, should I do this because this is I'm anxious about how this will turn out. He goes for it. He ultimately basically asks Akashi out on the date while in the nude.
Yep.
And he goes in front of everybody. He stands there in the nude, doesn't care, because that's like really a big thing about his character. Like, if this was him previously in this, he would have been, like, oh God, I'm ruined. I
He
want
would
this,
have run back to his room and
I want to be dead, because this like sort of image of how things should be. At the same time, at this point, he's basically accepted that he wants to live his life as he wants it. Basically, he's
well,
because who cares?
In this case,
like,
he's
if life
to
is
actually
awkward,
live. That's really the big choice.
yeah, he's like he doesn't care if, about awkward stuff, because it doesn't actually matter that much. In the sense of, like, if things don't go your way, that can be fine. Look at not necessarily just look at the bright side of everything that's bad, but more in the sense of try to live your life, without being crippled by self-doubt and anxiety.
Yeah.
Because that's, I think, one of his big other issues is that he basically is constantly holding himself back based off he's anxious that he won't manage to meet his ideal, instead of just going and actually doing things as he wants to.
Yeah.
As he actually, just going out and actually just living his life. Rather, he lets himself not actually live.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty good summary of it. So let's go into the visuals, because again, this is a Masaki Yuasa thing, and his style is really interesting. I mean, so the character designs in this were designed by the name is escaping me off the top of my head right now, but he did a lot of album art. He does a lot of kind of it's a very clean line style. I mean, this version it's a bit more rough, because Masaki Uesugi really likes kind of a hand drawn, rough hewn kind of line and style to it. But I thought the character designs were really nice. And
I love the character designs.
They're fairly simple overall, but Yuasa makes great use of them. Like, by making them simple, he's able to kind of distort and work with them in really interesting ways. And one of the things I really love, and one of the details like you often see in a lot of his things, is when the characters are drinking, they do this kind of they move almost like a water balloon, where the mass is on the top, and then as it moves down, so it's like watching a water balloon having like just bounced off of the ground and reach an equilibrium. He does that as like a way of them eating and drinking, which you'll see sometimes. It's kind of like a little trademark thing you'll notice in some of his other animation.
I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff visually here, in the sense of, like, it feels like they kind of like, okay,
Well, his use of
we could
color
have
is so
yeah. I think it's interesting, like, the fact of, like, you could have easily done this in live action to some degree. Like, the plot isn't so outlandish that they couldn't have done
he
it.
does also
It would
use
not- the
live
thing is-
action in it. He does use. That's the one thing.
Sure,
That's
they
the
use
one
these-
thing I kind of didn't like, was when they kind of
I like
when
that.
they used the
I
live
think they
action and
used-
filtered over it.
I think that actually looked pretty good, because the thing is, the way that they moved back and forth out of it, I felt was very interesting, because it didn't really feel like cost saving to me. It felt more like a visual style. Like, it worked for me in the sense of, like, the aesthetic of it. Like, I liked that. It's more the sense of, like, you could have done this all live action technically, but he manages to really put in a lot of like sort of cartoony sort of expressiveness to it, and a lot of the actual visuals they actually use just aren't like it's not. This is not anime generic sort of
Oh well, you also
this is live
it
action
never is.
pseudo
Well,
sim.
here's the thing. Well, for example, I think one of the things that like you were touching on something you couldn't do in live action is the way he drew the faces for the members of the cult, like
Mhm.
that weird face that they all had. You really couldn't get that kind of visual metaphor of a mask in the same way that you could do as powerfully, I think, in live action. So he very much, you could recreate this in live action, but he used the animation to its full extent.
I don't. The only thing I think with live action, I don't think you could actually get Ozu's face
Oh
right
no! Well,
ever.
and the transition of the way the face looks through most of the series
Sure,
until
because the thing is, the interesting thing is like towards the end, you actually see that he's got a normal ass human face. But every time you see him early on, because of Watashi's vision of how Ozu works as a entity, he looks like a fucking demon
well, and
always.
his eyes blink sideways. I mean, like it's, and he sometimes
Yeah,
has a weird little tail too. It's great.
yeah. And sometimes he's got a tail, sometimes it looks he's got like wings and shit. And it's like it's always like in horns. It's like he's got this mental image of how he looks, and so much of Watashi's mental image of how people are actually shapes the visuals, and that's super interesting.
Yeah, I mean, again, the way it's colored, the Watashi's viewpoint of the world literally colors the way we see it.
Hmm.
And when I say literally, I mean the show will often do this great duotone kind of thing where it's either a color in white or a color in black with maybe a little bit of white highlights in it, and it's just really good. I mean, just again the use of color where sometimes it'll be fairly naturalistic color, and then he will kind of break out into really expressionistic, and
Yeah,
I kind of love that, and he uses it at the right moment. The camera angles are all really good. I mean, the animation is not always like what I would say is smooth, but the direction like more than makes up for it, and also the smoothness isn't even what I would say is necessary for what he's getting across.
I mean, it's a little. I wouldn't even say it's jerky
Well,
because that
I
seems
would
to
say
imply sort of
choppy.
things. Choppy, but even I wouldn't even say it's like choppy in the negative sense. Like, ooh, that sticks out to me. I feel like they're going for something else, and I think almost to some degree, if it was overly smooth, it would actually stick out more
Yeah,
in the sense of
like I said,
like
it's not.
it's sort of
The
like with like
smoothness is not necessary to achieve what it
I,
is.
I think I think to some degree, like if it was actually smoother, it would feel sort of like it feels like having thing at too high a frame rate to some degree,
Yeah, it would
and
feel too
also the fact that
perfect. Hey,
yeah, yeah, it's also the fact of like the thing is so stylized that they actually use the choppiness really well because they do a lot of hard cuts at times between scenes,
yeah. Well, the
and I
pacing
think
you
having
have
things
to.
be a bit choppy
Well,
works.
like the way the editing works and like how abruptly they have to speed up, like they have to tell like 2 years in like 20 minutes essentially. So like
Yeah,
that choppiness oddly serves that editing style and that fast pace. So I mean, again, like it's just like all of Yuasa stuff. It is just really interesting visually. It does not look like anything else out there, which is just something I really appreciate about him.
one thing I really like about Yuasa is that while he has a very distinct sort of style, at the same time, all of his works are really divergent from each other in terms of their own internal style. Like,
Yeah.
this doesn't look like ping pong. This doesn't look like Kaiba. He's got his own, you can always see sort of like the Yuasa in works,
Well,
but at the same time, it's not like he's like a one trick pony of like, oh, everything looks the same. He can do a fairly wide range within his, sort of style. Because, ping pong, while having its own very weird faces, because that's how the manga sort of works and stuff, like looked, it was very more realistic than this, and this was more realistic than Kaiba was fucking crazy LSD esque, character designs at the time. But even this had a lot of weird stuff. Like, I think Higuchi's a good example of him looking at a fucking like eggplant for a head and stuff. Like, there's a lot of weird, designs here.
yeah. Well, they're very. I would say they're more iconic than they are realistic, but at the same
Hmm.
time, they're grounded. I guess like I think what you're getting at is that Yuasa has a style, but he's not stale. He
No.
does not rest on his laurels. So there is
Well,
something.
I
Well,
also say
basically, what it is no matter what he works on, it's recognizably him, but it's not. It's not form. It's not a formula. that he uses.
I mean, I would honestly say with like Satoshi Kon, his character designs stay fairly consistent in the sense of like how his visuals look. He doesn't diverge from that style. He found his style and he kind of stuck with it to some degree.
Yeah.
He's got a very consistent, coherent style. I don't feel like that's actually the case for Yuasa in the sense that Yuasa has his approach and he has his own stylistic sort of like elements, but he goes for a fairly wide range with that. He experiments a lot in terms of the actual ways that characters look, and all that's driven by specific works, and that's a lot of the fact driven by the fact that a lot of them are in fact adaptations, and those adaptations obviously come with their own inherent styles. But he works really well with those styles that he adopts.
Well, it's like his episode of Space Dandy, I think, is one of those examples where that's probably one of the bigger deviations from the way he usually draws, I think. And again, like there is, I think, if you look at all his works, there's certain stylistic,
Sure.
what I would say, quirks that are
there's
constant.
There's a through line to them.
Yeah, but at the same time, he's not stale. Like again, like it's very easy for a lot of people, like even as myself as an artist, is we kind of fall into formulas and methods of achieving results that don't require us to kind of rethink things just out of just expediency of like, okay, if I want to draw this thing, this is how I do it. I came up with a formula. Now I don't have to think about it. I don't have to, do a lot of extra observation to get it done. Now that I've got this down pat, I can kind of just, get it out there. But by doing so, you're sacrificing kind of a specificity and uniqueness to each drawing. And what he does is that he is very willing to not go into that formula. He's willing to kind of break his formula and come up with a new one for whatever he's working on.
Yes.
And that's very hard. It's very hard to do.
Yeah, like the styles always fit the works really well, both from like a narrative sense and like in each sort of. His styles never feel like they kind of diverge. Like they always feel perfect for the story that he's telling.
But he's also not a chameleon. So that's the
No,
thing.
he's
So
not.
like again, like he's auteurial, but he's again like stale or stiff. Like that's the best way I can really describe it, is that he doesn't disappear entirely into the work. He's not like one of those kind of those directors that you'll see in Hollywood every once in a while where he's like, who directed? Like
is this guy?
it's like,
He directed that thing?
They
Okay.
basically they're kind of like the studio band of sorts, but a director. Like they're
Sure.
they're the studio band equivalent, where their entire job is to disappear, is to highlight someone else in the work, is like either the writer or someone else. They're just there to get it, competently done and just get it out there.
At the same time, like I said, it doesn't feel like he's just doing the same. Some sort of copy paste of the sort of same artistic approaches.
Yeah,
he,
exactly.
He makes his artistic approach appropriate for the work that he's actually trying to.
Yeah, exactly.
create.
So I really, I can't recommend this one enough. I would say it's not as accessible, I think, as some of his other works. When I say accessible, I mean just it's a little bit hard to comprehend in comparison to the others. I think the storytelling, the last two episodes are
Dude, Kaiba?
that one you can narratively understand what's happening from one.
No way. Kaiba, like I got Kaiba, but also I've known from enough people watching Kaiba that a lot of people just bounce the fuck off of it. Like a lot of people do not get a lot of Yuasa's works just because he often has a very frenetic style. I think this one is actually very, very easy to get.
Well, no, I'm
personally.
saying it's not. I'm not saying it's not accessible. What I'm saying is, of his works, I found it of them to be more difficult, but that doesn't mean I'm saying it is difficult overall. What I'm saying is that of his work. So like overall, I think his work is very accessible. He never reaches the point of I'm completely confused. I think the confusion I have in this one is not his fault. I think it's something in the original. So it's really the last two episodes where I understood it, but I kind of felt like something in the way the story was composed just was not quite hitting it to me, and that felt something more like what was in the original book. It's something I have difficulty really kind of putting into words, but there was just like a slightly off feeling at the end and the way it all came together. But it worked, but there was just something like just that slightly, off key thing, and it wasn't a part of the visuals. It was just I think the entire story structure just had something in
Yeah,
there.
unfortunately, I'm gonna have to disagree because
Gotcha.
I actually thought the way it resolved was kind of perfect. I felt that it worked very well in a very sort of acceptable and sort of very sort of coherent sort of way in terms of that. Like, I think Tommy Galaxy is like one of my favorite animated works of all time, actually.
Hmm.
Not necessarily from like kind of like a oh it's so visually crazy sort of interesting standpoint, but I think the story that it has and the very fact that this work is incredibly good to actually rewatch, not necessarily from like a oh I missed details, but that it has a lot of stuff that when you watch it you pick up details that you probably missed the first time through, not because it was going too fast, but because there's a lot of things you learn later on that inform things that you encounter early on. You come to understand, like, wait, oh, that's why Higuchi was here, because this was actually tied into the proxy war. And so, like, oh, this money came in from this circumstance and this reason. It feels like a very nested sort of thing that works well. And I think Tatami Galaxy is actually, personally, I'd say it's like the most, assuming you can actually keep up with the subtitles, is I think it's that which is I think is the big thing that keeps people away is that there's not a dub of it. So if you're not capable of reading relatively fast subtitles, I think that's the big thing that actually would stop people to some degree. And in fact, I've heard that's one thing I've encountered people saying like, "Well, that's just too fast for me. I'd have to pause it constantly," which is not necessarily ideal. But if you're capable of keeping up with it, I think it's actually the most accessible of his works because it's least weird to some degree. It's a
It's
fairly
not mind game.
straightforward narrative. It's not Mind Game. It's not Kaiba.
Hmm.
It's not even Kimono Zume or even a lot of his earlier of his weirder works are very out there.
Yeah.
This one in Ping Pong felt like the most grounded.
Gotcha. Well, again, like my criticism of it does not mean I still don't think it's like. I mean, it's in. I mean, if I made a list of top ones, it would be a part of them. But I guess maybe more for me, it was kind of like it didn't hit me as hard as maybe another series would. And again, that's
Sure.
such a minor criticism in my mind. I think that's really what it was. It's that feeling I couldn't put into words is more that the ending of it didn't really hit my gut in the way that other stories have. Like, and again, that's just something that's going to happen from person to
There's gonna
person.
be personal taste.
Yeah, exactly. So I
mean,
think that's the
personally, when I
closest to my
watch,
criticism can really be of it in that
I
regard.
mean, my personal approach towards like the end of it, with every little detail of me just going, yeah, fuck yeah, like it's I find Tatami Galaxy actually very inspirational in the sense of not like necessarily inspiring me personally, but I think it's got a very inspirational sort of approach of like, hey, you've got to go and live your life. Don't stop sitting around, hoping things will turn out better, along a certain ideal. Like some story is going to come upon you and play out along those lines. You got to do it. You got to actually live a life. Your life isn't a story. You got to do it.
Yeah, I think it has a very valuable viewpoint in that regard.
Mhm.
So I think that's it. I think that's Tatami Galaxy. I mean, unless you weren't listening until this point, it's something we say you go out and fucking watch. I don't know how you got to this point without stopping the review and watching it before we got to this point. But hey,
I mean, even if you have it, even if you are here because of that, watch it because nothing we said actually diminishes its quality because it actually gets better with rewatches. That's
take
the
a
thing.
hold of the opportunity that's dangling in front of you on Hulu right now and fucking watch this thing. It's genuinely good and interesting, and just the acting's really good. I mean, Ozu's voice actor is goddamn amazing. I think I've heard him in a bunch of other stuff. I love it.
I think the cast in general is actually really good. That's a detail we didn't really touch
Yeah.
on. Like, it's got there's no real voice actor that stuck out as like bad to me or
No,
anything. I think
no. I mean, like again,
I think they're all really effective.
it's just for me. Ozu stuck out the most because I've recognized that voice from somewhere. That's the only reason. Like, it's not that his performance was better or worse. It was just like I recognize that voice from somewhere. I can't place it. God damn it.
I mean, he is Meow in Space Dandy.
That makes sense. I think he's also another character in Shirobako or something like that. I mean, I think he's a very prolific actor.
Sure,
So that
he is in fact a character in Chirubako.
yeah. So
As
I was right. Okay, I was recognizing it.
And Akachi was obviously Maya Sakamoto, who is one of the bigs, so to speak.
I'm really bad with the names of voice actors.
Maya Sakamoto is the one that's like involved in anything involving Yoko Kanno to some degree.
Oh, okay. That's
Because she's one of the ones where she likes having her sing because she's got a good singing voice.
Oh, okay. That's actually really
So
cool.
she was involved in like basically every Bone stuff. She was in she did Escaflowne. I think she was actually in Cowboy Bebop to some degree. But basically she's like everywhere. I think she was actually voiced. She also has a standpoint of like in like anything involving Yoko Kanno, she'll just voice a random side character at least because like she kind of I don't know if Yoko Kanno made her in the sense of like really got her pushed out there, but I think that's actually what that happened actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
Like kind
actually,
of responsible for her debut or something like that.
to some degree, yeah. And which is actually Yoko Kanno's apparently done that a lot. Thinking about that, it's like actually that's happened several times where she's like, oh, I like this person's voice. I'm gonna use her in music. You want to do a music, an anime that has a lot of music tied in with her, and then people are like, sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like Maya Sakamoto.
Gotcha.
Really good voice actors.
Cool.
But yeah,
So, like I said, go out and watch it. So, next time we are going to be covering Gem and the Holograms as a way of commemorating the movie having come out and being just as bad as everybody thought it was going to be.
We're not gonna watch that movie.
And basically having almost nothing to do with the craziness that is the original property. So we'll be watching 4 specific episodes: the beginning, Journey Through Time, Intrigue at Indy 500, and the Middle of Nowhere. I went through and tried to find ones that kind of encapsulate that era of television and fucked up premises and weird writing, and I don't remember all the episodes very well, so I'm hoping I pick good ones, but boy, is it the 80s-est fucking thing. So I'm excited to go through that. And then after that, we have one of your favorites, Freakazoid.
yes.
So we have a nice, fun, full schedule next time.
Yeah, and with Freakazoid, we're not going to be watching specific episodes.
Oh no, it's just
We're
Freakazoid in general.
Yep.
Like, yeah.
There's not too much of it, and hey, if you want to go watch some of it in preparation, just pick random episodes, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, and both of these I think are available on like YouTube in some form or another.
Yeah, and I think Freakazoid you can technically buy DVD sets at this point.
Yeah. So, all right. So, as always, you can reach us by email at adthepodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit us up on Twitter. Mine is at RYMagnuson.
I'm at SA Zorak.
All right. You got any projects to plug?
I got weird little thing is that on my Tumblr, I've been posting some dumb think pieces on a weekly basis.
Ghostmaster Zorak, huh?
Yeah, I wrote some. I used some demographic statistics to write about why ghosts are shit.
Yep.
They're bad. Ghosts aren't any good.
Turns out they're from so long ago that they're all fucking dumb.
Yeah, well, as it turns out, yeah, because when you run the numbers about when humans died in history,
And how many have? Yeah.
yeah, it turns out most of them, in fact, died prior to modern times. There's a lot of things you can assume based off that fact.
More human
So-
beings will have died in the died in the future than any other time in the past. So as we get going, they'll just be dumber and dumber and dumber.
Well, since eventually there will be better ghosts, but the thing is that keep in mind eventually.
But then in the future we'll be smarter than we were before. So the ghosts.
Well, when we become ghosts, we'll be shitty. But that's more the fact that everybody will have like cyborg arms, and we'll be really lame. Like nobody with cyborg arms is gonna be afraid of a ghost.
Yeah.
That's a pure fact.
Or they'll finally find a way to kill ghosts.
Maybe. So yeah, that's a little thing.
Yes. And how can they find your Tumblr?
I think that's actually just at it's essayzorak.tumblr.com.
There you go. All right, we will see you next time.